I saw the way they looked at you. Those 7 words, spoken in the lamplight of a dusty frontier office, would shatter everything Eleanor Whitcombe believed about herself. She had traveled 1,000 miles to disappear into usefulness, to fade into the background where women like her belonged. But Nathaniel Crowe, the most powerful man in 3 territories, had seen her. Really seen her. And that terrified her more than a lifetime of being invisible ever could. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories of quiet strength and unexpected love, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe, hit that like button, and comment with your city so I can see how far Eleanor's story travels across the world. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The stage that carried Eleanor Whitcombe into Silver Creek didn't announce her arrival with fanfare. It simply deposited her, along with 3 mail sacks and a crate of canned goods, into the August dust of a town that hadn't asked for her and wouldn't remember her name by winter. She was used to that. Eleanor descended carefully, her sturdy boots finding purchase on the wooden step. She wore a dove-gray traveling dress that had seen better days, practical and plain, with none of the fashionable bustle that made other women look like confections. At 34, she had long since abandoned the pretense that clothing could transform her into something she was not. The driver handed down her trunk without meeting her eyes. She thanked him anyway. Silver Creek sprawled before her in shades of brown and gold, weathered wood, sun-bleached dirt, and the distant shimmer of heat rising from the cattle plains beyond. It was smaller than she'd expected, but that suited her purpose. Small towns needed schoolteachers. Small towns asked fewer questions. Miss Whitcombe, she turned to find a woman approaching, perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of pinched expression that suggested chronic disapproval had carved permanent lines into her face. This would be Mrs. Violet Pemberton, head of the school board and, according to the terse correspondence they'd exchanged, Eleanor's new landlady, Mrs. Pemberton. "Thank you for meeting me." The woman's eyes traveled over Eleanor's form with the efficiency of a livestock assessor at auction. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, that old companion that whispered, insufficient. Inadequate. Too much and yet somehow not enough. "The stage is late," Mrs. Pemberton said, as though Eleanor had personally delayed it. "We'll need to hurry. Supper is at 6, and I don't hold the meal for anyone, of course. I apologize for any inconvenience." Eleanor hoisted her smaller bag while Mrs. Pemberton made no move to help. They walked through the town's main street, past the general store, the saloon, from which male laughter spilled like coins, and the butcher's shop, where a man in a blood-stained apron paused in his work to watch them pass, or rather, to watch Eleanor pass. She felt his gaze catch and snag on her figure, saw the slight downturn of his mouth. She had learned to catalog these micro-expressions the way a soldier learns to recognize the sounds of approaching danger. "The schoolhouse is at the north end of town," Mrs. Pemberton said, not slowing her brisk pace. 23 students currently enrolled, ages 6 to 14. "You'll teach reading, arithmetic, geography, and moral instruction." The previous teacher. She paused delicately. She married. Quite suddenly, Eleanor understood the implication. Marriage was an escape hatch. A rescue. It was not an option that applied to women like her. "I'm sure I'll manage the curriculum adequately," Eleanor said. "Adequately," Mrs. Pemberton repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it wanting. "Yes, well. Adequacy is certainly adequate." They turned down a narrower street where the houses stood further apart, their yards dusty and sparse. Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house was a 2-story structure that leaned slightly to the left, as though weary from years of standing upright. "Room and board is $8 monthly, paid in advance," Mrs. Pemberton announced as they entered. "I provide breakfast and supper. You'll share the washroom with 2 other boarders, both ladies. I run a respectable establishment. No male visitors. No alcohol. No impropriety of any kind." "I wouldn't dream of it," Eleanor said quietly. Her room was small, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that overlooked the alley behind the house. It smelled of lye soap and loneliness. Eleanor had inhabited many such rooms. She unpacked methodically, hanging her 3 dresses in the small wardrobe, arranging her books on the windowsill. Hawthorne. Dickens. A worn volume of Wordsworth's poetry that had belonged to her mother. These were her companions, the voices that filled the silence. That evening, Eleanor met her fellow boarders at supper. Miss Caroline Fletcher was perhaps 25. Pretty in a fragile, consumptive way, who taught piano to the town's wealthier children. Miss Abigail Porter was a seamstress, near Eleanor's age, with quick hands and quicker judgments. "So you're the new schoolteacher," Miss Porter said, buttering her bread with aggressive efficiency. "I hope you're sterner than the last one. These frontier children are practically wild." "I'm sure we'll find our rhythm," Eleanor replied. "You came from back east?" Miss Fletcher asked, her voice soft as moth wings. "St. Louis, most recently. Before that, Cincinnati. Boston before that." "My, you've moved about considerably," Mrs. Pemberton observed, in a tone that suggested frequent relocation was evidence of moral deficiency. Eleanor offered no explanation. She had learned that people preferred to fill silences with their own assumptions rather than accept uncomfortable truths. Let them think what they wished, that she was running from scandal or family shame or some romantic disappointment. The reality was simpler and more complex. She moved because staying anywhere long enough meant watching people's initial politeness curdle into pity or contempt. Better to keep moving. Better to be useful until usefulness wore out its welcome, then move again. "You'll meet everyone properly at church on Sunday," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "I trust you are a church-going woman." "I am." "Good." Reverend Michaels gives a powerful sermon. And it's important that the schoolteacher set a proper example. Her eyes flickered over Eleanor's figure again, that assessing gaze that said, "You'll need all the respectability you can muster." The schoolhouse was indeed at the north edge of town, a simple wooden structure with 6 windows and a bell that hung silent in the morning air. Eleanor arrived an hour before the children were due, wanting to familiarize herself with the space that would be her domain. The room smelled of chalk dust and childhood, that particular mixture of ink, wood shavings, and the wild outdoor scent that children carried in their hair. Desks stood in 4 rows, carved with the initials of students past. A blackboard dominated the front wall. A map of the United States, slightly outdated, hung beside it. Eleanor ran her hand along the teacher's desk, feeling the grain of the wood. This, at least, was familiar territory. She might be unwelcome in drawing rooms and at social gatherings, but here, in the realm of declensions and multiplication tables, she had authority. She was writing the day's lessons on the blackboard when she heard the first footsteps on the porch. The children arrived in clusters, siblings walking together, friends in groups, a few solitary ones who hung back as though uncertain of their welcome. Eleanor stood at the door and greeted each one by name, having memorized the roster Mrs. Pemberton had provided. There was Tommy Yates, age 7, with a cowlick that defied gravity. The Brennan sisters, ages 9 and 11, in identical calico dresses. Marcus Webb, 14, who looked at Eleanor with the particular disdain teenage boys reserve for authority figures who don't meet their standards of respectability. "Everybody find a seat," Eleanor instructed once the bell had rung. Youngest students in front, eldest in back. There was a shuffling and jostling as children claimed their territories. Eleanor waited, patient, until the room settled into attentive silence. "Good morning. I am Miss Whitcombe, your new teacher. I know you're curious about me, and I'm certainly curious about you. We'll learn together, which is the finest kind of education there is. You're fat," a voice announced from the back row. Eleanor turned to identify the speaker. It was Marcus Webb, arms crossed, challenge in his eyes. Several children gasped. Others giggled nervously. Eleanor felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the old shame that never quite healed. But she had been teaching for 12 years. She had weathered worse than teenage cruelty. "I am," she agreed calmly. "I'm also educated, patient, and exceedingly difficult to shock." Now, if you're quite finished with your observational skills, Mr. Webb, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your reading comprehension. She handed him a book. Open to a random page. Please read aloud from the marked passage. Marcus's confidence faltered. He stumbled over the first sentence, his face reddening. That's enough, Eleanor said, not unkindly. I can see we have work to do. All of us. That's what we're here for. The day proceeded with the rhythm of lessons, reading circles, arithmetic problems copied onto slates, a geography lesson about the Great Lakes that seemed impossibly distant from this dusty frontier town. Eleanor moved among the rows, helping, correcting, encouraging. By day's end, she was exhausted in the particular way that teaching demands, every faculty engaged, every sense alert to the thousand tiny dramas of a classroom. Miss Whitcombe. It was Sarah Brennan, the younger sister, lingering as the others filed out. I liked your lesson about Lake Superior, thank you, Sarah. Have you ever seen a large body of water? No, ma'am. Just the creek when it floods, perhaps one day you will. Education opens doors to the world. The girl smiled and ran to catch up with her sister, leaving Eleanor alone in the empty schoolhouse. Through the window, she could see the children dispersing into their various lives, toward the ranches, the shops, the homes that anchored them to this place. Eleanor had no such anchor. She gathered her materials, tidied the desks, and prepared to walk back to Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, where she would eat a silent supper and retreat to her small room to read by lamplight until sleep came. This was her life. It was useful. It was respectable. It was, in its way, enough, or so she told herself. Sunday arrived with its inevitable summons to community observation. Eleanor dressed in her best dress, a dark blue wool that was too warm for the season but conveyed appropriate solemnity. She walked to the small clapboard church with Mrs. Pemberton and the other boarders, aware of the eyes that tracked their progress through town. The church was already half full. Eleanor slid into a pew near the back, next to Miss Fletcher, and studied the congregation while pretending to study her hymnal. She recognized several of her students and their families. There were cowboys in clean shirts, merchants in Sunday suits, women in their finest calicos and muslins, and there, in the front pew, sitting alone in a space that seemed to expand around him like a private territory, was a man she didn't recognize. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His clothes were expensive, she could tell by the cut of his coat, the quality of the fabric, but worn with the unself-consciousness of someone who didn't need to think about money. His profile was stern, almost harsh, carved by sun and circumstance into something beyond conventional handsomeness. That's Mr. Crowe, Miss Fletcher whispered, noticing Eleanor's gaze. Nathaniel Crowe. He owns the largest ranch in 3 territories. Silver mines too. They say he's worth more than the rest of the town combined. Eleanor nodded, looking away. Rich men were as distant from her reality as the Lake Superior she'd taught about, vast, powerful, and utterly irrelevant to her daily existence. The service began. Reverend Michaels preached about charity and judgment, which Eleanor found ironic given the judgmental glances she'd already catalogued. She sang the hymns in her clear alto, prayed during the prayers, and tried to feel something approximating spiritual connection. Afterward, on the church steps, Mrs. Pemberton materialized at her elbow. Come, Miss Whitcombe. You should be introduced to some of our more prominent citizens. Eleanor had no choice but to follow, smiling politely as she was presented to the butcher and his wife, the proprietor of the general store, the town doctor, a weary-looking man who smelled of carbolic and tobacco. And this, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice acquiring a reverential quality, is Mr. Nathaniel Crowe. Eleanor looked up, and up. He was taller than she'd realized, with gray eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Mr. Crowe, may I present Miss Eleanor Whitcombe, our new schoolteacher, Miss Whitcombe. His voice was low, surprisingly gentle. Welcome to Silver Creek. Thank you, Mr. Crowe. I'm pleased to be here. He studied her for a moment, not the assessing gaze she was used to, but something more thoughtful, as though he were reading a text in an unfamiliar language and wanted to understand it properly. "I hope the position suits you," he said. "Education is a noble calling. I find it rewarding." A woman in an elaborate hat, Mrs. Delacroix, the banker's wife, inserted herself into the conversation with the skill of someone accustomed to managing social hierarchies. "Mr. Crowe, I wanted to discuss the autumn dance committee." Eleanor stepped back, releasing him to the demands of more important people. She had learned not to take up space where she wasn't needed, but as she turned away, she felt it, a gaze that lingered a moment longer than politeness required. She glanced back, almost involuntarily, and found Nathaniel Crowe still watching her, his expression unreadable. Then someone else claimed his attention, and the moment passed like a stone dropped into deep water, leaving ripples she couldn't quite identify. The week settled into routine. Eleanor taught her students, endured the subtle condescension of Mrs. Pemberton's supper table, and spent her evenings reading or preparing lessons. She was competent, reliable, invisible in all the ways that mattered. One afternoon, as she was dismissing class, a man appeared in the schoolhouse doorway. He was dressed like a ranch hand, weathered and practical. "Pardon me, ma'am. Are you Miss Whitcombe?" "I am. Name's Jack Porter. I work out at the Crowe Ranch. Mr. Crowe asked me to deliver this to you." He handed her an envelope, thick paper with her name written in bold, decisive script. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." She waited until the man had gone before opening it. Inside was a brief letter. "Miss Whitcombe, I am seeking someone to organize the accounts and correspondence for my ranch operations, and to provide basic education to the children of my workers, approximately 8 children, ages varying. The position would be in addition to your current duties, 3 afternoons per week. Compensation would be commensurate with the additional responsibility. If this interests you, please respond at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Nathaniel Crowe. Eleanor read the letter twice, her heart beating faster than the situation warranted. Additional income would be welcome, teaching paid barely enough to cover her room and board. And yet, working in proximity to Nathaniel Crowe felt dangerous in a way she couldn't articulate. Not because she feared him, but because of that look he'd given her after church, that moment of being seen that had unsettled something she'd thought long dormant. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. She would need to think about this. To weigh the practical benefits against the vague, inexplicable sense that accepting would change something fundamental. But as she walked back to the boarding house in the amber light of late afternoon, Eleanor already knew what her answer would be. Practical women didn't refuse opportunities because of feelings they couldn't name, and Eleanor Whitcombe had been practical for 34 years. Eleanor penned her acceptance that evening by lamplight, her handwriting careful and measured. She kept the response brief and professional, as befitted a business arrangement, though her hand trembled slightly as she sealed the envelope. The next morning, she posted it at the general store, where Mr. Hendricks, the postmaster, took it with barely a glance. "Out to the Crowe Ranch, is it?" he said, noting the address. "That'll go out with the afternoon delivery." By the following day, she had her answer. Jack Porter appeared at the schoolhouse again, this time with a more detailed letter outlining the terms of employment and requesting she begin the following Monday. 3 afternoons per week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. A wagon would collect her at 3 o'clock and return her to town by evening. The pay was generous, almost half again what she earned from teaching. Mrs. Pemberton's reaction at supper that night was predictably complicated. "The Crowe Ranch," she repeated, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "Well, that's quite an opportunity." Miss Porter, the seamstress, leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. "You'll be working directly for Mr. Crowe?" "My goodness, Miss Whitcombe. He's the most eligible man in 3 territories. Every unmarried woman within 50 miles has set her cap at him. I'm to organize accounts and teach the workers' children," Eleanor said quietly. "Nothing more, of course," Miss Fletcher murmured, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. Eleanor felt the familiar heat of judgment, though this time it wore a different face. They didn't believe a man like Nathaniel Crowe could have professional interest in a woman like her. They assumed ulterior motives, either his or hers, because the alternative, that she might simply be qualified for the position, seemed implausible to them. She excused herself early that evening and retreated to her room, where she tried to read Wordsworth but found the words sliding off the page like water off glass. Instead, she stared out her window at the darkening sky and wondered what she'd set in motion. The Crowe Ranch lay 8 miles southwest of Silver Creek, accessible by a road that carved through open grassland where cattle grazed in scattered groups like punctuation marks across a vast, golden sentence. Eleanor made the journey that first Tuesday sitting in the back of a supply wagon driven by Jack Porter, who proved taciturn but not unfriendly. Been working for Mr. Crowe long? Eleanor asked, making conversation. Going on 12 years now. He's a fair man, pays well, don't ask more than what's reasonable. Some of the other ranchers. Jack shook his head. Let's just say I'm glad I work where I do. The ranch buildings appeared gradually, first the distant windmill, then the barn and outbuildings, finally the main house itself. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, a 2-story structure of whitewashed wood with a wraparound porch and real glass in all the windows. Not ostentatious, but substantial. Permanent. A house that expected to stand for generations. Jack helped her down from the wagon. Mr. Crowe's expecting you in his office. Through the front door, second room on the left, Eleanor smoothed her skirt, adjusted her hat, and climbed the porch steps. The front door stood slightly ajar. She knocked anyway. Come in. Nathaniel Crowe's voice carried through the dim interior. She entered, her eyes adjusting to the relative darkness after the bright sunlight. The house was cooler inside, surprisingly elegant. The hallway had polished wood floors and walls lined with what appeared to be genuine oil paintings, landscapes mostly, of mountains and plains she didn't recognize. The office was a masculine space, functional rather than decorative. A large desk dominated the room. Its surface covered with ledgers, correspondence, and survey maps. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with volumes that looked actually read rather than merely displayed. Through the window behind the desk, she could see the barn and corrals, where men worked with horses. Nathaniel Crowe stood as she entered. He wore working clothes, a plain shirt, vest, trousers tucked into boots, but carried himself with the same quiet authority she'd noticed at church. Miss Whitcombe. Thank you for coming, Mr. Crowe. Thank you for the opportunity. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Please, sit. I wanted to explain the position more fully before we begin. Eleanor sat, folding her hands in her lap. And waited. The ranch employs 32 men, he began, settling back into his own chair. Several have families living on the property. There are 8 children currently, though that number fluctuates. I've established a small schoolroom in one of the outbuildings, but the previous teacher. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She found the isolation difficult and left rather abruptly. I understand, the accounts have become somewhat tangled. My foreman, Mr. Sullivan, is excellent with cattle but less gifted with numbers. I need someone to organize the ledgers, track expenses, manage correspondence with suppliers and buyers. Someone detail-oriented and trustworthy. I'm both, Eleanor said simply, his mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Yes. I believe you are. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned you came highly recommended from your previous position. Eleanor was surprised Mrs. Pemberton had said anything complimentary, but she merely nodded. I've always found satisfaction in bringing order to chaos, then we should suit each other well. He stood and moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a heavy ledger. This is the primary accounts book. As you'll see, the entries are sporadic. He laid the ledger on the desk between them, opening it to a page filled with crossed-out figures, marginalia, and what appeared to be coffee stains. Eleanor leaned forward, her professional instincts immediately engaged. This wasn't chaos, this was catastrophe. May I? She asked, reaching for the book. Please. For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor paged through the ledger, her dismay growing. Entries were undated or misdated. Expenses were listed without categories. Some pages appeared to be missing entirely. It would take weeks to untangle this mess, perhaps months. "This is quite comprehensive work," she said diplomatically. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, watching her. "You mean it's a disaster? I mean it will require significant time and effort to rectify. Can you do it?" Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes. But not in the hours we've discussed. This is easily a full-time position, at least until the accounts are properly organized. What would you suggest? Keep me for full days 3 times per week instead of afternoons. I can teach the workers' children in the morning, work on the accounts through the afternoon. That gives me time to travel to and from town and still maintain my position at the schoolhouse." He considered this, his expression unreadable. "Full days would mean providing you with lunch. And the work might run late on occasion. That's acceptable, $20 per month, then. Plus meals when you're here." It was more than she'd expected, combined with her teaching salary. It was more money than she'd ever earned. Eleanor felt a flutter of something between hope and fear. Financial security was a door that had always remained closed to her. Now it stood slightly ajar. "That's very generous, Mr. Crowe. It's fair compensation for considerable work." He pulled a sheet of paper toward him and began writing. "I'll draft a formal agreement. You can review it and sign if the terms are acceptable." As he wrote, Eleanor studied him covertly. His hands were large but moved across the paper with surprising grace. His hair curled slightly at his collar, as though he'd missed his last appointment with the barber. There was a scar along his jawline, faded white against sun-darkened skin, some old injury. Long healed. He looked up suddenly, catching her observation. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but he simply slid the document across the desk toward her. "Take your time reading it." The agreement was straightforward and more favorable than she'd dared hope. She signed her name at the bottom in her careful script. "Excellent." Nathaniel stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to the enterprise, Miss Whitcombe." His hand enveloped hers, warm, calloused, firm. Eleanor felt the contact like a small electric shock and withdrew perhaps too quickly. "Shall I show you the schoolroom?" he asked, seemingly unaware of her discomfort. They walked across the yard toward a small building set apart from the main structures. Inside was a single room, simple but adequate, with benches, a blackboard, and shelves containing a modest collection of books and slates. "I leave the curriculum entirely to your judgment," Nathaniel said. "Most of these children have had minimal formal education. Their parents want them to read, write, and manage basic arithmetic. Beyond that, teach whatever you think worthwhile. What about you, Mr. Crowe? What do you think they should learn?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Why does my opinion matter? You're their employer. Or will be, eventually. Surely you have thoughts about what education serves them best." He was quiet for a moment, looking out the small window toward the plains beyond. "I think they should learn that the world is larger than this ranch, this town, these plains. That they have choices, even if those choices are limited by circumstance. That their minds are their own property, perhaps the only property that can never be taken from them." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, recognition, perhaps. This was not the philosophy of a typical cattle baron concerned only with profits and property. "Then we agree completely," she said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to thicken with something unnamed. Then Nathaniel cleared his throat and stepped back. "The children typically arrive around 9. I'll have Mrs. Chen, she manages the household, prepare lunch for you around noon. You can work in the office afterward. I'm often out on the property, but if you need anything, Mrs. Chen or Jack Porter can help." "Thank you." He walked her back to the main house, where Jack Porter was waiting with the wagon to return her to town. As Eleanor climbed aboard, she glanced back at the house and saw Nathaniel standing on the porch, watching her departure with that same thoughtful expression. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at 9 to find 8 children already waiting, 5 boys and 3 girls, ranging from perhaps 6 to 13 years old. They regarded her with the wary curiosity of young animals encountering something new. "Good morning," Eleanor said, setting down her bag. "I'm Miss Whitcombe. I know some of you have had teachers before, and some haven't. Either way, we're starting fresh today. Why don't we begin by having each of you tell me your name and one thing you're curious about?" A small girl with dark braids raised her hand tentatively. "I'm Maria. I want to know why the sky is blue," Eleanor smiled. "Excellent question, Maria. We'll explore that." Next, one by one, the children introduced themselves. There was James, who wanted to know how far away the stars were. Anna, who asked why horses couldn't talk. Thomas, the eldest, who wanted to understand numbers well enough to keep accounts like his father. By the end of that first morning, Eleanor felt the familiar satisfaction of work well begun. These children were bright, curious, starved for knowledge in the way only children without regular schooling could be. She gave them simple lessons, assigned reading practice for the older ones, and promised they would tackle more ambitious topics as they progressed. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, was a Chinese woman of indeterminate age with quick movements and shrewd eyes. She served Eleanor lunch in a small dining room adjacent to the kitchen: cold chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from the ranch garden. "You teach good," Mrs. Chen said, setting down a pitcher of water. "Children talk about you at dinner last night. Say you know many things, they're eager learners. That makes teaching a pleasure, Mr. Crowe. He think education very important." His wife, "She teach before." Mrs. Chen stopped abruptly, as though realizing she'd said too much. Eleanor kept her voice casual. "I didn't realize Mr. Crowe was married. Long time ago. She died." Mrs. Chen busied herself clearing dishes that didn't need clearing. "I talk too much. You excuse me." She left Eleanor alone with this new information. So Nathaniel Crowe was a widower. That explained the solitary pew at church, the austere quality to the house despite its elegance, the sense of self-containment she'd sensed in him, that afternoon. Eleanor lost herself in the ledgers. She created new categories, transferred entries to fresh pages, cross-referenced dates with invoices she found filed haphazardly in a drawer. It was painstaking work, but satisfying in its own way, finding order hidden within disorder, making sense of confusion. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear Nathaniel enter the office until he spoke. "You've been at that for 4 hours straight." Eleanor looked up, startled. The light through the window had shifted to late afternoon gold. "I apologize. I should have asked permission to work this long." That wasn't a criticism. "I'm impressed by your focus." He moved closer, looking at her careful notations. "You've already made more progress than I'd hoped. It's quite satisfying, actually. Like solving a puzzle, most people find bookkeeping tedious. Most people haven't had to account for every penny they've ever earned." The words emerged before Eleanor could stop them, too personal, too revealing. She felt heat rise in her face. "I apologize." That was inappropriate, but Nathaniel simply pulled up a chair and sat beside her, close enough that she could smell leather and soap and sun-warmed cotton. "Why did you come here, Miss Whitcombe?" "To Silver Creek, I mean. You're clearly overqualified for teaching in a frontier schoolhouse." Eleanor kept her eyes on the ledger, though the numbers had become meaningless shapes. "I needed employment. The position was available. That's an answer, but not the truth." She looked at him then, surprised by his directness. His gray eyes were steady, not unkind, simply waiting. "I move frequently," she said finally. "Every few years, I find it prudent to seek new situations." "Why?" "Because staying in one place means people come to certain conclusions about you. About your prospects. About why you remain unmarried at an advanced age." She heard the bitterness creep into her voice and hated it. "I prefer to leave before the pity becomes unbearable." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't pity you, Miss Whitcombe, most people do." "Then most people are fools." He stood, moving to the window, his back to her. "I hired you because you're competent, educated, and I suspect you have no interest in the social maneuvering that most people confuse with actual work." Was I wrong? No. Eleanor's throat felt tight. "You weren't wrong, then let's make an agreement. You do the work I've hired you to do, and I'll judge you solely on that basis. Your age, your marital status, your appearance." He gestured vaguely, still not looking at her. "None of that is relevant to me." Eleanor should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment. Of course he had no interest in her appearance. Why would he? She was useful, that was all. Useful and competent and safely beyond the sphere of feminine complication. "Thank you, Mr. Crowe. That's very fair, I try to be." He turned back, his expression unreadable once more. "Jack will be ready to drive you back within the hour. Can you finish up by then?" Of course. He left her alone with the ledgers and the dying afternoon light and the strange, hollow feeling that lodged somewhere beneath her ribs. She told herself it was hunger. Or fatigue. Or simple foolishness, but that night, lying in her narrow bed at Mrs. Pemberton's, Eleanor replayed the conversation in her mind and wondered why Nathaniel Crowe's careful indifference hurt more than all the cruel assessments she'd endured from others. The weeks accumulated like layers of sediment, each one settling atop the last until Eleanor could no longer remember what her life had been like before the rhythm of Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday at the Crowe Ranch. The work absorbed her completely, mornings with the children, who were progressing faster than she'd dared hope, afternoons untangling the chaos of accounts until order emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Nathaniel himself remained an enigma. He was often absent during her visits, riding out to distant pastures or meeting with buyers and surveyors. When he was present, he treated her with unfailing courtesy that somehow felt more impersonal than rudeness would have been. He never lingered in the office while she worked, never asked about her life beyond the ranch, never gave any indication that she was anything more than a particularly useful employee. Eleanor told herself this was precisely what she wanted. Professional respect without personal complication. Yet she found herself listening for his footsteps in the hall, found her attention sharpening when he entered a room, found herself observing details she had no business noticing, the way he rubbed his temple when concentrating, the slight limp he tried to hide after long days in the saddle, the rare, transformative quality of his smile when one of the children said something particularly clever. It was dangerous, this noticing. Eleanor recognized the signs of her own foolishness the way a sailor recognizes the distant approach of a storm. She tried to discipline her thoughts, to focus solely on her work, but the heart had its own logic that defied rational management. October arrived with the first breath of autumn. The plains turned gold and amber, the air carried a sharper edge, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the warmth of the ranch office as she worked through the afternoon hours. She had successfully reorganized the accounts, implementing a new system that Nathaniel had praised as remarkably efficient. The children were reading at levels beyond their years. And little Maria could now explain why the sky was blue with the confidence of a natural philosopher. It was on a Thursday afternoon, with the first serious cold front moving in from the north, that everything changed. Eleanor was alone in the office, finalizing the quarterly accounts, when she heard raised voices from outside. She moved to the window and saw Nathaniel and another man arguing near the barn. The stranger was perhaps 50, well-dressed but with the kind of hardness that expensive clothes couldn't quite conceal. His voice carried across the yard, sharp with anger. "You can't hold out forever, Crowe. Every other rancher in the territory has agreed to the new shipping rates. You think you're better than the rest of us. I think the rates are extortionate and I won't be party to it." Nathaniel's voice was quieter but no less firm. "Find another way to line your pockets, Garrison. This is business, not personal. You're a fool if you don't see that, and you're a thief if you think I don't see exactly what you're doing." "The meeting is over." Garrison's face darkened. "You'll regret this." When winter comes and you can't move your cattle, when your beef rots in the fields because no trains will take it, you'll come crawling back. And the rates will be double what they are now, then I'll find another way. I always do. The man left, spurring his horse with unnecessary violence. Nathaniel stood watching him go, his shoulders rigid with tension. Then he turned and saw Eleanor in the window. For a moment their eyes met across the distance, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten, not anger, but a bone-deep weariness that spoke of battles fought too long alone. He came inside moments later, his boots heavy on the floorboards. Eleanor had returned to her desk, pretending absorption in the ledgers, but she felt his presence fill the room like a change in air pressure. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. "Enough to understand you're in some kind of difficulty." He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Frank Garrison owns the railroad spur that services most of the ranches in this territory. He's decided to increase shipping rates by 40%. He claims it's necessary for maintenance and improvements, but everyone knows he's simply exploiting his monopoly. Can't you use a different route? The nearest alternative is 200 miles north. By the time we drove the cattle that far, we'd lose more in weight and depth than we'd save in shipping costs." He turned to face her, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, not of profit and loss, but of whether he could trust her with deeper truths. "He's trying to force me to join a ranching cooperative he controls. Once he has enough members, he'll control the market prices, the shipping, everything. The smaller ranchers will be squeezed out. And men like Garrison will own the entire industry. What will you do? I don't know yet. But I won't surrender my autonomy to a man like that." He rubbed his temple in that unconscious gesture she'd come to recognize. "I'm sorry. This isn't your concern. If it affects the ranch's finances, it becomes my concern." Eleanor spoke carefully. "I've been through the accounts thoroughly now. You have reserves, but not enough to weather a season without income. If Garrison makes good on his threat, then I'll be in serious trouble." "Yes." He sank into the chair across from her, suddenly looking older than his years. "My wife used to tell me my stubbornness would be my undoing." Perhaps she was right. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife directly. Eleanor felt she was witnessing something private, something she hadn't earned the right to see. "Stubbornness and principle aren't the same thing, Mr. Crowe, aren't they? Sometimes I think principle is just stubbornness dressed in fancier clothes." He looked at her directly then, and something in his gaze had changed. The professional distance had thinned, revealing something more raw beneath. "Do you ever wonder if doing the right thing is worth the cost?" Eleanor thought of all the years she'd maintained her dignity, refused to diminish herself for approval, chosen self-respect over acceptance. "Every day. But I wonder more what it would cost not to." "That's a good answer." He smiled faintly, but the weariness remained. "You're a surprising woman, Miss Whitcombe." "How so?" "Most people offer empty reassurances when faced with difficult truths. You don't. Empty reassurances help no one." "No. They don't." He stood, moving toward the door, then paused. "It's getting dark earlier now. And that storm front is moving in faster than expected. You should stay for dinner, wait out the worst of it before Jack drives you back." It was practical advice, nothing more. Yet Eleanor felt the invitation settle over her like a weight, laden with implications she couldn't quite name. Sharing a meal felt different from their professional interactions, more intimate somehow, as though crossing an invisible boundary neither had acknowledged existed. "I wouldn't want to impose, you wouldn't be. Mrs. Chen always makes too much food anyway." His tone was light, but his eyes held something else, something that made Eleanor's pulse quicken despite her better judgment. "Please. I'd welcome the company." They ate in the formal dining room, a space Eleanor had glimpsed but never entered. It was elegant in an understated way, polished wood, simple but beautiful furniture, windows that overlooked the darkening plains where the approaching storm gathered like bruised silk on the horizon. Mrs. Chen served beef stew rich with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Nathaniel had changed into a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing. Across the table, he looked different somehow, less like the formidable cattle baron of reputation and more like simply a man, tired from a long day, seeking brief respite in conversation. "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor said, surprising herself. If it's not too painful to speak of. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. Her name was Catherine. We met in Denver. She was teaching at a girls' school there. I was young, ambitious, newly successful, convinced I could build an empire if I only worked hard enough. He smiled without humor. She saw through that immediately. Told me money wasn't an empire, it was just money. That the only thing worth building was a life that meant something. She sounds wise, she was. Too wise for me, probably. He looked toward the window, where the first fat drops of rain were beginning to strike the glass. She came here as my wife, left behind her family and her city comforts, never complained. She taught the workers' children. That schoolroom you use now, she designed it. She made this house a home instead of just a place to sleep between workdays. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. We had 5 years together. Then one winter, a winter much like this one promises to be, influenza swept through the territory. It took her in 3 days. His voice remained steady, but Eleanor heard the ancient grief beneath it, worn smooth by time but never truly diminished. I was in Cheyenne negotiating a business deal. By the time I got the telegram and made it home, she was already gone. I'm so sorry, everyone is sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything. He met her eyes, and she saw something fierce there, almost defiant. I blamed myself for years. If I'd been here, if I'd gotten better doctors, if I'd done 1,000 different things. But Catherine would have told me I was being a fool. She didn't believe in that kind of guilt. She believed in living fully while you could, because you never knew how much time you had. Do you still blame yourself, sometimes? Less than I did. He picked up his coffee, cradling the cup in both hands. What about you, Miss Whitcombe? You know my ghosts now. It seems only fair I know yours. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. No one had ever asked about her pain directly. Most people preferred to assume she had none, that a woman like her existed in some neutral state beyond hurt. I have no grand tragedies to share. Just the slow accumulation of small rejections. Being passed over, looked through, dismissed as unworthy before anyone bothered to know me. You lose someone you loved, that's a clean wound, however deep. Mine have always been more like bruises, never quite healing because the world keeps pressing on them. That sounds worse, in its way, does it? At least I was never given something precious and then had it taken away. I've never known what I'm missing. Yes, you have. Nathaniel's voice was gentle but certain. You know exactly what you're missing. That's why you move every few years, isn't it? Because staying in one place means watching others have what you believe you can't. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and looked down quickly, ashamed. That was perceptive. I recognize loneliness, Miss Whitcombe. I've been intimate with it for 7 years now. The rain was falling in earnest now, drumming on the roof, turning the windows into rivers of distorted light. In the enclosed space of the dining room, with the storm building outside and lamplight casting warm shadows, Eleanor felt the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack. Why did you really hire me? She asked quietly. You could have found a bookkeeper anywhere. Someone with more experience, better credentials. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. Because when I saw you at church, standing there with everyone looking past you as though you were invisible, I recognized something. Not pity, he added quickly, seeing her expression. Recognition. The isolation of being seen only for what you're not instead of what you are. you're a wealthy, powerful man. How could you possibly? People see my money and my land. They don't see me. They want things from me, business opportunities, social advancement, a way to improve their own standing. But they don't want to know who I actually am. They're afraid of the answer. He leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes intent. When I spoke with you that first time, you didn't treat me like a collection of assets. You treated me like a person who might have something worthwhile to say. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Eleanor's heart was beating too fast, her thoughts tumbling over themselves. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to understand that your presence here, it's not charity. It's not convenience. You make this place feel less empty, and I hadn't realized how much I needed that until you arrived. The words hung between them, trembling with implications neither seemed ready to name. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains like the voice of something ancient and inevitable. Eleanor felt she was standing at a precipice, that the next word spoken would determine whether she stepped back to safety or forward into unknown territory. Mr. Crowe, Nathaniel. Please. We're well past formality now, I think, Nathaniel. His name felt strange and intimate on her tongue. I need to ask you something directly, because I can't afford to misunderstand. Do you? She struggled for words that wouldn't expose her too completely. Is this conversation still about employment? He held her gaze, and she saw him wrestling with his own answer. Measuring truth against caution. I don't know, he said finally. I know what it should be about. Professional respect, appropriate boundaries, all the things that make sense and protect us both. But lately I find myself hoping you'll stay late, looking forward to Tuesday mornings more than a man should look forward to bookkeeping consultations, noticing things about you I have no business noticing. What things? The way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're concentrating. The small smile you get when one of the children grasps a difficult concept. The kindness in your voice even when you're delivering hard truths. He stood abruptly, moving away from the table as though distance would help him maintain control. I'm not saying this well. I sound like a fool, you don't. Eleanor rose too, her legs unsteady. You sound like someone who's been alone too long. As have I believed myself incapable of this, Nathaniel said, his back still to her. After Catherine died, I was certain that part of my life was finished. That I'd had my chance at connection and lost it, and the decent thing was to simply continue. Be useful, be fair, but not hope for anything more. And now, he turned to face her, and in his expression she saw the same conflict she felt, desire warring with fear, hope struggling against the weight of old wounds. Now I find myself in the impossible position of developing feelings for a woman who deserves better than a grief-scarred rancher with more stubbornness than sense. The room seemed to contract, all the air drawn tight between them. Eleanor forced herself to speak through the tightness in her throat. You should let me decide what I deserve, should I? Because from where I stand, you deserve someone who can offer you the world, society, culture, admiration. Not just a ranch 8 miles from nowhere and a man who's forgotten how to be anything other than alone. I don't want the world. Eleanor moved closer, drawn by something stronger than caution. I've never wanted the world. I want to be seen, truly seen, by someone who values what they find. And for the first time in my life, I think. She faltered, then pushed forward. I think that might be possible. Nathaniel's expression shifted, something breaking open in his face. Eleanor, the use of her first name felt like a confession. She waited, barely breathing, for what would come next. I can't promise you anything, he said quietly. I don't know how to do this anymore. I might fail you in 1,000 ways, then fail me. That would still be more than most people have given me. The chance to be failed as a real person rather than dismissed as an inconvenience. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the pulse beating in his throat. For a long moment they stood there, suspended in possibility. "This is foolish," he murmured. "Probably. We barely know each other. I know enough. If anyone finds out, the gossip, let them talk." "They already do." Nathaniel raised his hand slowly, giving her time to retreat, and gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, the gesture he'd confessed to noticing. His fingertips grazed her cheek, and Eleanor felt the touch resonate through her entire body like the first notes of a symphony. "You have proven me mistaken," he said softly. "About so many things. About what I was capable of feeling. About what I deserved to want. About the possibility of beginning again." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sorrow. For the first time in her 34 years, someone was choosing her, not settling, not pitying, but actively choosing her with full knowledge of who she was. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "So am I." Outside, the storm reached its peak, rain lashing the windows with furious intensity. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, two lonely people stood on the threshold of something neither fully understood but both desperately needed, gathering courage to step forward into a territory more dangerous than any frontier, the possibility that they might, after all, deserve to be loved. They didn't kiss that night. Nathaniel dropped his hand and stepped back, creating space that felt both necessary and unbearable. Eleanor understood. They were both too bruised by life to rush headlong into anything, no matter how desperately they might want it. Instead, they returned to the table and talked until the storm passed, speaking of small things and large ones, building the foundation that physical intimacy alone could never provide. When Jack finally drove her back to town through the rain-washed darkness, Eleanor sat in the wagon feeling as though she'd been fundamentally altered at the cellular level. The world looked different, felt different, as though she'd been living her entire life in dim light and someone had finally opened the shutters. Mrs. Pemberton's sharp eyes missed nothing at breakfast the next morning. "You were quite late returning from the ranch yesterday, Miss Whitcombe. The storm delayed us." Mr. Crowe thought it prudent to wait until the worst had passed. How considerate of him. The words dripped with insinuation. "One must be careful of appearances, of course. Particularly for someone in your position." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "My position as an employee doing honest work for honest wages?" "Yes, I'm quite careful of that." Miss Porter suppressed a smile behind her napkin, but Miss Fletcher looked worried, her pale face even more drawn than usual. After breakfast, she caught Eleanor's arm in the hallway. "Please be careful," she whispered. "I don't mean to presume. But Mrs. Pemberton has been talking to people. About you and Mr. Crowe. She's suggesting things that could damage your reputation severely." "What things could she possibly suggest?" "That I'm efficiently managing his accounts, you know what I mean. A wealthy, unmarried man and a woman alone with him for hours at a time. People talk, Eleanor. They always do, and they're rarely kind." Eleanor felt a flash of anger, not at Miss Fletcher who meant well, but at the suffocating web of propriety that made honest work suspect, that turned competence into scandal simply because she wasn't young or beautiful enough to be considered a romantic threat. Except now she was a threat, apparently. And that made everything different. "Thank you for the warning," Eleanor said quietly. "But I won't stop doing work I'm good at because small minds make vicious assumptions." She maintained that resolve through the following days, but awareness of scrutiny made every action feel weighted with significance. When she walked to the schoolhouse, she felt eyes tracking her movement. When she purchased supplies at the general store, conversations stopped and resumed only after she'd left. The town was watching, judging, waiting for confirmation of whatever story they'd already decided was true. Sunday at church was worse. Eleanor felt the collective attention like heat on her skin. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men's gazes slid away from hers with embarrassed complicity. Even Reverend Michael seemed to pause meaningfully during his sermon about resisting temptation, though perhaps that was Eleanor's imagination. Nathaniel sat in his usual pew, seeming oblivious to the undercurrent of speculation, but Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders. After the service, when Mrs. Pemberton would have steered Eleanor quickly away, he approached directly. "Miss Whitcombe. Might I have a word?" The conversations around them died instantly. Eleanor felt the weight of perhaps 50 pairs of eyes boring into her back. "Of course, Mr. Crowe." He drew her slightly apart, though still within view of the congregation. Propriety observed. "If barely. I've heard there's been talk. Unpleasant talk. There's always talk, not about me. Not like this." His jaw tightened. "I won't have your reputation damaged because of your association with me. My reputation was never sterling to begin with. I'm a spinster schoolteacher past her prime. The worst they can say is that I'm trying to trap a wealthy man, which would at least give me credit for ambition. Eleanor, don't." She kept her voice low but fierce. "Don't apologize for something that isn't your fault. Don't suggest I should stop coming to the ranch. Don't treat me like I need protection from gossip that I've endured in various forms my entire life. Then what should I do? Stand beside me. That's all. Just don't pretend I'm invisible when people are watching." Something shifted in his expression, determination replacing uncertainty. "I can do that." He offered his arm. It was a simple gesture, almost old-fashioned, but in that moment and that context it was a declaration. Eleanor hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric of his coat. They walked together back toward the main group, where Mrs. Delacroix and several other prominent townswomen stood in a cluster. "Ladies," Nathaniel said pleasantly. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Mrs. Delacroix's smile was sharp as glass. "Indeed, Mr. Crowe. We were just discussing the autumn dance. I do hope you'll attend this year. You've been absent from our social gatherings far too long. I'll consider it." "Miss Whitcombe, do you enjoy dancing?" The question fell like a stone into still water. Eleanor felt every woman's attention focus on her with laser intensity. "I haven't danced in many years, neither have I. Perhaps we're both overdue." He smiled down at her, and Eleanor saw in his eyes a challenge, not to her, but to everyone watching. "I should let you return to your boarding house. I'll see you Tuesday." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing in the center of a circle of stunned faces. Mrs. Pemberton recovered first. Her expression resembling someone who'd bitten into a lemon. "Well. How very unexpected." Eleanor excused herself and walked home alone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just been publicly claimed, however subtly, by the most powerful man in 3 territories. The implications would ripple through Silver Creek like shock waves, and she had no idea whether the result would be elevation or destruction. The answer came sooner than expected. On Monday morning, as Eleanor was preparing her lessons, a delegation arrived at the schoolhouse. 3 women, Mrs. Delacroix, Mrs. Pemberton, and a thin, hawk-faced woman Eleanor didn't recognize. "Miss Whitcombe," Mrs. Delacroix began without preamble. "We need to discuss your position here." Eleanor set down her chalk carefully. "Is there a problem with my teaching?" "Your teaching is adequate. Your conduct, however, is becoming a matter of concern." "My conduct has been entirely professional, has it?" The hawk-faced woman spoke for the first time. "You spend hours alone with Mr. Crowe. You arrive back in town at unseemly hours. You allow him to single you out at church. This is a small town, Miss Whitcombe. We have standards that apparently don't apply when men conduct business alone with male associates, but become urgent when a woman does the same work. This is different and you know it," Mrs. Pemberton snapped. "Mr. Crowe is an unmarried man of considerable means. Your intentions, my intentions are to do the work I was hired to do. If you have evidence of impropriety, present it. Otherwise, this conversation is over. We're trying to help you," Mrs. Delacroix said, her tone softening into something worse than anger, pity. You're not the sort of woman who, what I mean is, a man like Mr. Crowe would never seriously, say it plainly." Eleanor's voice was deadly quiet. You're not the sort of woman a man like that could want. That's what you mean, isn't it? I'm too plain, too old, too heavy to be anything other than an embarrassment to him. Is that it? The silence confirmed what the words hadn't. Eleanor felt something calcify in her chest, hard and cold and protective. I understand perfectly. Thank you for clarifying where I stand. She turned back to her blackboard. Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. They left in a rustle of skirts and righteous disapproval, but Eleanor knew this wasn't over. She had been warned, and warnings in small towns carried the weight of ultimatums. Conform or be cast out. Accept your place or face consequences. She taught her classes that day with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. The children sensed something wrong and were subdued, even young Tommy Yates, who usually couldn't sit still. When the last student left, Eleanor sat at her desk and stared at nothing. Trying to decide what came next, the answer arrived on Tuesday morning in the form of a letter from the school board, delivered by a nervous-looking clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. Eleanor read it twice, each word landing like a physical blow. The board had received concerns about her conduct. While they appreciated her service, they felt it best to terminate her employment at the end of the month. They would provide a reference letter, naturally, should she seek a position elsewhere. They hoped she understood this was in everyone's best interest. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bag. Her hands didn't shake. She had been dismissed before, though never quite so baldly. Never with so little pretense of actual cause. She knew what this was: punishment for daring to be seen with a man they believed was above her station, for not accepting their assessment of her worth, for having the audacity to be valued by someone who mattered. She went to the ranch that afternoon as scheduled, teaching the children as though nothing had changed. They were working on long division, Maria struggling with a particularly difficult problem. Eleanor knelt beside her desk, guiding her through the steps. When Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, "Miss Whitcombe, might I speak with you when the lesson concludes?" His voice was formal, his expression carefully neutral, but Eleanor saw the tension in his posture. He knew something. She nodded, her stomach clenching. When the children had been dismissed, Nathaniel closed the schoolroom door and turned to face her. "I heard what happened. The school board's decision. News travels fast. I'm on the school board, Eleanor. I was at the meeting where they voted. I argued against it. I was the only dissenting vote." She absorbed this, along with the realization that he'd used her first name without hesitation, privacy making them equals in a way public spaces never would. "It's done, then. I'll finish out the month and move on. It's not the first time. Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. Somewhere that needs a teacher. There's always somewhere. Or you could stay." He moved closer, his eyes intense. "You could marry me." The words hung in the air between them, too large and too sudden. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, as though the earth had shifted on its axis. "That's not a solution," she said when she could speak. You can't possibly. We've known each other barely 2 months, I know. It's too fast, too impulsive, probably the most irrational thing I've ever suggested." He ran a hand through his hair, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "But I've been thinking about it for weeks. Not because of the gossip or the school board, though those certainly force the issue. Because I'm tired of being alone. Because I'm tired of pretending I don't care about you. Because every time you walk out of this ranch, I spend the next 2 days counting hours until you return. You can't marry me out of loneliness. That's not fair to either of us. I'm not proposing out of loneliness. I'm proposing because in 2 months you've become essential to my existence, and I can't imagine going back to how things were before you arrived." He took her hands, his grip warm and firm. "I know this isn't a fairy tale. We're both too old and too scarred for that. But we could build something real together. Partnership. Respect. Companionship. Maybe even love, if we're brave enough." Eleanor wanted to say yes with an intensity that frightened her. But years of caution, of protecting herself from disappointment, made her hesitate. People will say terrible things. They'll say I trapped you, that you're making a mistake, that I'm taking advantage. Let them say it. I stopped caring what people think 7 years ago when Catherine died. The only opinion that matters is yours. His gray eyes searched her face. Do you want this? Not because it's practical or solves your employment problem, but because you genuinely want to try building a life with me. Did she want it? Eleanor examined her heart with the same careful precision she brought to ledgers and lesson plans. What she found there was complicated, desire mixed with fear. Hope tangled with doubt, but underneath it all, a fundamental truth she couldn't deny. Yes, she whispered. I want it terribly. That's what frightens me most. Then be frightened with me. We'll figure it out as we go. He pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor felt herself melt against him, feeling the solid reality of his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. She was 34 years old, and this was the first time she'd been held with genuine tenderness, without pity or obligation or hesitation. This is going to be difficult, she said into his shirt. Most worthwhile things are. They'll never accept me. The town, the other ranchers' wives, society, I don't need them to accept you. I need you to accept yourself. To believe you deserve this. He pulled back enough to look at her face. Can you do that? Eleanor thought about all the years she'd made herself small, invisible, acceptable. Thought about the script she'd been handed that said women like her should be grateful for scraps and never dare to want whole meals. Thought about how tired she was of living that way. I can try, that's all I'm asking. He smiled, and it transformed his face into something almost young. We'll try together. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with only Jack Porter, Mrs. Chen, and the workers' families as witnesses. Reverend Michaels officiated with visible reluctance. Clearly disapproving but unwilling to refuse Nathaniel Crowe outright. Eleanor wore a new dress in deep green that Mrs. Chen had helped her select from the dressmaker's shop, ignoring Miss Porter's barely concealed shock that someone of Eleanor's figure would choose such a bold color. The ceremony itself was brief. Nathaniel's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. When it came her turn, Eleanor felt the weight of the moment, not just the legal binding, but the fundamental choice she was making to believe herself worthy of this, to step into a life she'd never imagined possible. I do, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, almost tentative, as though they were both still learning the grammar of physical affection. But Eleanor felt it resonate through her entire body, a promise of intimacy still to come, of gradual discoveries and careful unveilings. Mrs. Chen had prepared a wedding supper, and they ate surrounded by people who actually seemed happy for them, the ranch workers who'd come to respect Eleanor's teaching, the children who adored her, Jack Porter who raised his glass and said simply, to two people who deserve some happiness. About damn time. That night, Eleanor stood in what was now her bedroom, the room Nathaniel had shared with Catherine. Though he'd told her quietly that he'd had it completely refurnished, every piece of furniture new, every trace of the past carefully removed. It was her space now, if she wanted it, or their space, if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure which she wanted yet, and Nathaniel had told her there was no rush, that they could navigate their physical relationship at whatever pace felt right. It was another kindness in a long string of kindnesses, but Eleanor found herself almost frustrated by his patience. She'd spent 34 years being treated as though she were somehow separate from desire, as though her body exempted her from the full range of human experience. There was a soft knock at the door. Eleanor. May I come in? Yes. Nathaniel entered, still dressed but with his collar loosened, his feet bare. He looked younger this way, more vulnerable. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. Mrs. Chen left fresh water, and there are extra blankets in the wardrobe if you get cold. I have everything, thank you. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, like strangers instead of people who just vowed to spend their lives together. Then Eleanor laughed, a sound that surprised them both. This is absurd. We're both terrified, completely, Nathaniel agreed, his mouth quirking into a smile. I'd forgotten how intimidating new beginnings are. Come sit with me. Eleanor moved to the small sofa by the window, and after a moment's hesitation, Nathaniel joined her. Tell me about the shipping problem with Garrison. Have you found a solution? He blinked, clearly not expecting business talk on their wedding night. I'm exploring options. There's a smaller rail company that might be willing to extend their line if I can guarantee enough business. It would mean coordinating with some of the other independent ranchers, the ones Garrison is trying to squeeze out. Exactly. United, we might have enough leverage to break his monopoly. He leaned back, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. But that's not what you want to talk about on your wedding night. Isn't it? We're partners now, Nathaniel. Your problems are my problems. Besides, she added softly, talking about practical things is easier than acknowledging that we're both wondering what comes next. I meant what I said. There's no pressure. We have time. Eleanor turned to face him fully. What if I don't want time? What if I'm tired of waiting for permission to want things? She saw his expression shift, heat kindling behind the careful courtesy. Eleanor, I've spent my entire life being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that desire wasn't meant for women like me. That I should be grateful for scraps of attention and never presume to ask for more. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. But you've given me more. You've treated me like someone who deserves to be wanted. And I find myself wanting in return, very much, and that's terrifying but also exhilarating, and I don't want to waste another moment pretending otherwise. Nathaniel raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Then we won't pretend. But I need you to understand, I'm out of practice at this. It's been 7 years, and even before that, I was young and probably more clumsy than I realized. I might disappoint you, or I might disappoint you. My experience is considerably more limited than yours. That's not possible, then we'll muddle through together. The way we do everything else. He kissed her then, not gently this time but with real hunger, and Eleanor responded with matching intensity, all the longing of 34 years pouring into that contact. They broke apart breathless, and Nathaniel's laugh was shaky. We might actually manage this after all. What followed was indeed clumsy at points, tentative at others, but also deeply tender in a way Eleanor had never imagined. Nathaniel treated her body with reverence, as though she were something precious rather than something to be tolerated or endured. And Eleanor discovered that desire, long suppressed, could bloom with surprising force when finally given permission, afterward. Lying in the darkness with Nathaniel's arm around her and his breathing evening into sleep, Eleanor felt something unlock inside her chest, some ancient conviction that she was fundamentally unworthy of this kind of intimacy, this kind of peace. She was 34 years old, and for the first time in her life, she belonged somewhere. Not because she'd made herself useful, but because someone had chosen to build a life with her. The town's reaction to their marriage was predictably mixed. Some people were scandalized, others pitying, a few, mostly the workers and their families, genuinely pleased. Eleanor endured it all with a dignity born of years of practice, but now she had something she'd never had before, Nathaniel beside her. Making it clear through word and action that he'd made his choice and wouldn't be swayed by public opinion, Mrs. Pemberton gave her notice to vacate the boarding house with barely concealed satisfaction, as though Eleanor's marriage confirmed some moral failing rather than contradicted all her grim predictions. Eleanor packed her few belongings without regret. She'd lived in rooms like that for too many years, spaces that were merely functional, never truly home. The school board's dismissal stood, of course, but Eleanor found she didn't mind as much as she'd expected. She continued teaching the workers' children at the ranch, and the curriculum expanded organically as she realized she had the freedom to teach what actually mattered rather than what committee-approved syllabi dictated. She taught them literature and philosophy alongside arithmetic, encouraged their questions instead of demanding rote memorization, helped them see education as liberation rather than obligation, the shipping crisis resolved itself slowly but decisively. Nathaniel formed an alliance with 5 other independent ranchers, pooling their resources to guarantee business for the smaller railroad company. The company agreed to extend their line, and suddenly Garrison's monopoly was broken. The man raged and threatened, but ultimately had to lower his rates to remain competitive. "You did it," Eleanor said when the contracts were finally signed. They were in the office, her organizing papers while he reviewed the final terms. "You beat him, we did it. Your financial analysis showed the other ranchers that cooperation was more profitable than capitulation." They wouldn't have listened to me alone. Eleanor felt a flush of pride. She'd done that, provided value beyond her presence, contributed something concrete and measurable. It mattered more than she'd expected, that validation of her competence alongside the validation of her worth as a person. Winter came to the plains with its customary ferocity, transforming the landscape into something stark and beautiful. Snow erased the boundaries between earth and sky, and the ranch became an island of warmth and light in a frozen sea. Eleanor discovered she loved the isolation, the way the weather forced them into intimate proximity, the long evenings by the fire where they talked about everything and nothing. She also discovered that marriage to Nathaniel meant inheriting his complications. In January, Frank Garrison made one final attempt at revenge, spreading rumors that the new railroad extension was financed through fraudulent means and that Nathaniel had bribed officials. The accusations were baseless but gained enough traction to require formal investigation. Eleanor watched Nathaniel weather the storm with grim determination, and she understood something fundamental about the man she'd married. He didn't bend, even when bending would have been easier. It was that quality that had first drawn her attention, that refusal to compromise his principles for convenience. But she also saw the cost of that stubbornness, the way it isolated him from potential allies who preferred safer paths. "You don't have to fight every battle alone anymore," she told him one night when he was particularly worn down by the investigation. "You have me now. Let me help." He looked at her with something like wonder. "I'm not used to that. Having someone in my corner, get used to it." "I'm remarkably persistent." She drafted letters to the investigating officials, laying out the timeline and documentation with lawyerly precision. She coordinated with the other ranchers' wives, building a network of support that put social pressure on the town's leadership to resolve the matter fairly. Within 6 weeks, the investigation concluded with a complete exoneration and a formal censure of Garrison for making false accusations. "You're formidable," Nathaniel said when it was over, pulling her into his arms. "I'm not sure I fully appreciated that before. Most people don't. They see what they expect to see. I see you. All of you. And I'm grateful every day that you said yes." Spring arrived with its annual promise of renewal. The plains erupted in wildflowers, painting the landscape in improbable colors. Eleanor stood on the porch one morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, and realized she'd stopped bracing herself for the inevitable moment when this would all prove temporary. She belonged here. Not conditionally, not contingently, but absolutely. The ranch had become home in a way no place had ever been before. The children in her makeshift classroom called her Mrs. Crowe with genuine affection. The workers' wives invited her to their homes, sought her advice, included her in their lives. Even in town, the initial hostility had faded into grudging acceptance, helped by the fact that Eleanor's marriage had clearly not been the opportunistic scheme everyone predicted. Mrs. Delacroix, of all people, had become something almost like a friend after Eleanor had helped her daughter prepare for the entrance examinations to a ladies' academy back east. The girl had been accepted, and Mrs. Delacroix had shown up at the ranch one afternoon with a cake and an apology. "I was unkind to you," she'd said stiffly. "I made assumptions that were unwarranted." "I'm sorry." Eleanor had accepted the apology with grace, understanding that this was as close to friendship as someone like Mrs. Delacroix could manage. It was enough. More than enough, actually, a sign that the world was capable of surprising her in pleasant ways as well as painful ones. One evening in late May, Eleanor was working in the garden she'd started behind the house, vegetables mostly, but also flowers because she'd discovered a previously unknown desire to grow beautiful things. Nathaniel found her there, dirt on her hands and sun on her face, and sat on the ground beside her. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's usually dangerous." He smiled. "I want to expand the school. Make it a proper academy for all the children in the area. Not just the workers' families. Hire additional teachers, build a dedicated building, maybe even provide boarding for students from distant ranches." Eleanor sat back on her heels, studying him. "That's ambitious. And expensive. I can afford it. More importantly, it's needed. You've shown me what real education can do, how it changes lives, opens possibilities. I want to do that on a larger scale." He took her hand, mindless of the dirt. "I want you to run it. Design the curriculum, hire the teachers, make all the decisions about how it operates. It would be your school, Eleanor. Your legacy." She felt tears prick her eyes. This was more than opportunity, it was validation of everything she'd ever believed about education's power. About her own capacity to make a meaningful difference. It was Nathaniel saying, "I see not just who you are, but who you could become, and I want to help you get there." "Yes," she said through the tightness in her throat. "Yes, absolutely yes." They began planning immediately, drawing up sketches and budgets and curricula at the dinner table, debating philosophy and practical details late into the night. It was the kind of partnership Eleanor had never imagined possible, intellectual and emotional and practical all at once, each enriching the others. The school broke ground in July, and Eleanor threw herself into the project with passionate intensity. She corresponded with educators across the country, researched progressive teaching methods, interviewed potential instructors. Nathaniel watched her bloom into this new role with obvious satisfaction, occasionally reminding her to eat or sleep when she became too absorbed. On a warm evening in late summer, they rode out to the site where the school building was taking shape. The frame was up now, walls beginning to enclose what would become classrooms. Eleanor walked through the skeleton structure, imagining it filled with children and books and ideas. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Eleanor leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest. "I'm thinking about how different my life is now from what I expected a year ago. How much has changed, good different, impossibly good different. Sometimes I still wake up expecting it to have been a dream." He turned her to face him, his expression serious. "It's not a dream. You're here, we're here, this is real. You deserve all of it, Eleanor. The home, the work, the partnership. You've always deserved it, I'm starting to believe that." Finally, they stood there as the sun set, painting the plains in those impossible frontier colors, and Eleanor felt the last piece of her old armor fall away. She had spent so many years believing herself fundamentally unworthy of love, of being chosen, of matching to someone beyond her utility. But here she was, held by a man who valued her mind and her heart and her presence equally, building something meaningful together, creating a life that was rich and full and entirely their own. The school opened in September to 23 students, some from the ranch, others from town, a few from homesteads 30 miles away whose families arranged boarding. Eleanor hired 2 additional teachers, both women who'd been dismissed from other positions for being too progressive or too outspoken or too unconventional. They understood what she was trying to build, not just an academy, but a sanctuary where different kinds of minds could flourish. The autumn dance came around again, and this time Nathaniel insisted they attend. Eleanor wore a new dress, deep blue silk that Mrs. Chen had insisted she needed, and tried not to feel self-conscious about her figure as they entered the crowded hall, but Nathaniel took her hand and led her directly onto the dance floor, and when they began to waltz, Eleanor realized something fundamental had shifted. People were watching, yes, but with interest rather than judgment, some even with approval. She and Nathaniel had become a known quantity, an established couple, part of the community's fabric rather than an aberration within it. "You're smiling," Nathaniel observed. "I'm happy. Genuinely, unreservedly happy." I didn't think that was possible for someone like me. Someone like you, someone who was told repeatedly that happiness wasn't meant for women who looked like me, who were my age, who didn't fit the prescribed mold." Nathaniel's arms tightened around her. "Those people were idiots. And I'm grateful for every one of them, because their blindness meant you were still available when I finally had the sense to look properly." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying across the dance floor. "That's a generous interpretation, it's the truth. You are the finest thing that's ever happened to me, Eleanor Crowe." The absolute finest. Later, much later, they stood on their porch looking out at the star-scattered sky. The plain stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and vast and full of possibility. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, resigned, defensive, certain that her life's trajectory was fixed and unchangeable. That woman seemed impossibly distant now, separated by more than time. "What are you thinking about?" Nathaniel asked, as he so often did. Eleanor considered how to answer, how to capture the complexity of what she felt. "I'm thinking about belonging. How I spent so many years believing I didn't belong anywhere, that I was fundamentally unsuited to connection. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else but here." "You belong here. You've always belonged here, even before you arrived. I was just waiting for you to find your way." "That's rather romantic for a cattle baron. I have my moments." He pulled her closer, and they stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other despite all the obstacles that should have kept them apart. She was not loved in spite of who she was, Eleanor realized, but because of it. Nathaniel had seen her clearly, her strengths and her wounds, her competence and her vulnerabilities, and had chosen her anyway. More than chosen her, had built a life around her, had made space for her to become more fully herself than she'd ever been allowed to be, and Eleanor, who'd spent 34 years believing herself invisible, had learned to let herself be seen. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done and the most rewarding, this gradual unveiling, this cautious trust. But she'd done it, was still doing it every day, choosing courage over protection, connection over isolation. The plains wind carried the scent of upcoming winter, but Eleanor felt no fear of the cold months ahead. She had a home now, and work that mattered, and a partner who valued her completely. She had students who would carry forward the lessons she taught them. She had a community that, however grudgingly, had made room for her. Most importantly, she had herself, not the diminished, apologetic version she'd carried for so many years, but the full, complete person she was meant to be. Competent and kind, intelligent and resilient, worthy of love and capable of giving it in return. Eleanor Whitcombe Crowe stood on her porch in the gathering darkness and felt, for the first time in her life, entirely at peace with who she was and where she belonged. It had taken 35 years and a journey of 1,000 miles to arrive at this moment, but she'd made it. She was home.